You would not have lasted a week in the Old West, not because you lacked courage or the rugged grit celebrated in Hollywood mythology, but because the American frontier wasn't a romantic test of character. It was a ruthless, unyielding gauntlet of biological luck, brutal environment, and material survival. The real frontier collected the unprepared with a terrifying, calculated efficiency. And the forces that would have ended you aren't the ones you're expecting. It wasn't the enemy over the ridge. It was the very water in your canteen. It was the loaded weapon in your own trembling hands. It was the absolute crushing silence of a desolate winter plain. Here is the raw, unvarnished evidence of how the frontier actually broke people. The frontier collected the unprepared with the thoroughness of a system that had been calibrated for exactly that purpose. You were unprepared. Here is the evidence. The water would have killed you first, not the outlaws, not the raids, not the violence that the popular account of the frontier has always placed at the center of the story, because violence is dramatic and water is not. The overland trails between Missouri and the Pacific carried somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 emigrants between 1840 and 1869. The leading cause of death along those trails was not combat, not starvation, not exposure. It was cholera, a waterborne bacterial infection that the contaminated creek water and the fouled trailside springs delivered to anyone who drank without the specific knowledge of which sources were clean and which ones had received the runoff from the encampments of the thousands of people who had passed through the week before. Cholera worked fast. A man who drank contaminated water in the morning could be dead by the following morning. The specific rapid dehydration that severe cholera produces moving through the body with a clinical efficiency that the frontier's medical resources were entirely unequipped to interrupt. The trail diaries of the emigrant period document this with the specific, numbed brevity of people who had stopped being surprised by it. Another man taken this morning, gone by nightfall. You would have drunk from the same sources. You would not have known which ones to avoid. The knowledge of which creek bend was safe and which had been fouled by the upstream encampment was the kind of knowledge that survivors possessed, and that guidebooks could not adequately convey to people who had never seen the specific visual and olfactory indicators of contaminated water on the open plain. The water would have found you before you found the water's problem. The frontier's popular mythology placed the gun at the center of every mortal encounter. The fast draw, the duel, the outlaw ambush, the specific dramatic violence that the Western genre made the defining feature of frontier life. The documented record tells a different story. Accidental firearm deaths along the emigrant trails and in the frontier settlements consistently exceeded combat deaths in the records of the era. The muzzle-loading rifles and percussion revolvers that the frontier ran on required a loading sequence, powder, ball, ramrod, cap, that was performed routinely, repeatedly, and in conditions ranging from calm morning to panicked darkness, by hands that ranged from experienced to trembling. The accidental discharge, the misfire that fired when it was not supposed to, the hunting accident in brush thick enough that the target and the man behind the target were not always distinguishable until after the trigger was pulled. If you survived the water, the gun would have been the next candidate, not someone else's, your own, in the dark, in the brush, in the specific moment of distraction that the frontier produced in people who were managing too many variables simultaneously and had not yet learned which ones could be safely ignored. The winter of 1886 into 1887 is the specific season that the frontier's mythology has never found a comfortable way to address, because it does not fit the narrative of rugged individualism triumphing over adversity. It fits the narrative of adversity winning. Temperatures across the northern plains dropped to 40 degrees below zero and stayed there for weeks. The cattle herds that the open-range cattle industry had built across a decade of expansion, herds numbering in the millions, spread across the grasslands of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, died in numbers that the spring thaw documented in the specific, devastating form of carcasses stacked along every riverbank and drainage course in the northern range country. Between 50 and 90% of the cattle on the northern plains died in that single winter. The industry that had been the economic engine of the frontier's final decade effectively ceased to exist. The men who worked those ranges fared better than the cattle, marginally. The documented accounts of cowboys who survived the winter of 1886 describe shelter conditions, food conditions, and fuel conditions that the word survival barely contains. Men burning furniture for heat in February, men rationing food that had been calculated for a winter of standard severity and was now being stretched across a winter that standard severity did not approach. Men who made it to spring in the specific condition of people who have discovered where their absolute physical limits actually lie, which is a different place than where they believed those limits to be when the winter started. You did not know where your limits were. The winter of 1886 would have located them for you. The winter of 1886 into 1887 is the specific season that the frontier's mythology has never found a comfortable way to address, because it does not fit the narrative of rugged individualism triumphing over adversity. It fits the narrative of adversity winning. Temperatures across the northern plains dropped to 40 degrees below zero and stayed there for weeks. Assume you survived the water. Assume you avoided the accidental discharge. Assume you endured the winter. At some point, the frontier's medical establishment would have had its opportunity. The frontier doctor of the 1870s and 1880s operated at the intersection of genuine skill and catastrophic limitation. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that specific microorganisms cause specific infections and that the prevention of those infections required the specific interruption of specific biological chains of transmission, was achieving scientific acceptance during exactly these years. It had not yet achieved the practical implementation that would have protected the patients of the frontier's medical practitioners from the consequences of its absence. Surgical instruments were cleaned between procedures with the thoroughness that the era's understanding of infection prevention required, which was not the thoroughness that the era's infections required to be prevented. A wound that would be addressed with a brief outpatient procedure today was addressed with amputation, which was the frontier surgeon's most reliable intervention for infected injuries, not because it was gentle, but because it was decisive. The infection in the limb could not survive the removal of the limb. The patient survived the removal at a rate that the frontier surgeons documented and did not publicize. If the water had given you cholera, the doctor's treatment for cholera involved opium and rest, and the hope that your constitution would resolve what the medicine could not. If the gun had given you a wound, the doctor's treatment involved a probe to locate the ball, extraction if it was locatable, amputation if the wound was in a limb and infection had arrived, and morphine throughout, on the specific grounds that whatever happened next was going to require the attenuation of sensation that only morphine could provide at the scale the frontier required it. You would have survived the frontier doctor in the same statistical proportion that his other patients survived him, which was not high. This is the cause of death that the frontier's mortality record does not list, because the 19th century had no clinical category for it, and the men who experienced it had no language adequate to describe it. And the culture surrounding them had no tolerance for the acknowledgement that it constituted a genuine threat. The isolation of a homestead claim on the Dakota Plains in January, a sod house, a family, the nearest neighbor 3 miles away across ground that a blizzard had made impassable, the nearest town a day's ride in conditions that a blizzard had made suicidal, produced in the people inside it a psychological condition that the diaries and letters of the Homestead era document with the specific, understated language of people recording something they do not have a name for. The women's accounts are the most honest. They describe the silence, the specific quality of a silence that the wind does not break, but only deepens. The darkness that arrived at 4 p.m. in December and stayed until 8 a.m. and contained in its hours everything that the daylight hours had not resolved and would not resolve. The specific weight of a season that was going to last 4 more months regardless of what the people inside it required it to do. The frontier did not care what you required of it. It never did. You would not have lasted a week. Not because the frontier was populated by harder people than you. The skeletal record of the men and women who lived and died inside. It documents poor dental health, advanced arthritic changes in people in their 20s, the specific accumulated physical deterioration of bodies asked to perform at levels that the bodies were not designed to maintain indefinitely. They were not harder than you. They simply had no alternative to continuing. The frontier did not offer alternatives. It offered the water and the gun and the cold and the doctor and the silence. And it waited to see which one found you first. One of them always did.